this guy slumped over drunk or is he howling with the wolves? Wait to see and find out. Alrighty, I'm back and buzzing with the painting El Jaleo by John Sargent, made in 1882. Sargent has an interesting background, and if he was born in the modern world, he probably would end up being one of those Instagram influencers, if I'm being honest. I mean, we're talking about a guy who was born in Italy to wealthy American parents, traveled very often, went to Beaux-Arts Academy at 18, had commissions by high-class clientele, was a key player in the aesthetic movement, which basically means he was a trendsetter, more on that later, and was even involved in 1 or 2 scandals during his career. I mean, that's like half the checklist of requisites to be an influencer these days. I digress. Preceding the creation of this masterpiece, Sargent took a trip to Spain in 1879. Most records say that he initially went to Spain to study the works by Velázquez in the Prado, but he either deviated or indulged his true intentions when spending time in places like Granada, where he made several sketches of flamenco dancers. There are a few reasons as to why I think he was drawn to this genre of music that I'll mention now and then go into later in the video. First, he was proficient in guitar himself, so there must have been a natural bias there. Second, I think he saw flamenco as a perfect fit for his contributions to the aesthetic movement as a balance between aesthetic movement conventions and flamenco tradition. He returned to Paris in February of 1880 and almost immediately began preparatory sketches for El Jaleo. He would bring in models to a studio to help him map out the composition and even painted a couple studies for the final product. When he first exhibited the painting in the Paris Salon of 1882, it was received with mixed reactions. Some adored the piece, calling it the great masterpiece of Sargent's early years. Others trashed on it, with one critic saying it has nearly all the faults a picture could have. But even those who didn't resonate with El Jaleo couldn't help but admit its merits. That same critic writes that it is beautiful and approximately true to the effect intended in tone, in color, and in light. It's always funny to see people have mixed reactions about a painting but forced to admit its objective greatness. Anyway, El Jaleo was immediately sold to Schaus & Company, a New York art dealer, and just as quickly sold to Thomas Jefferson Coolidge, who eventually was convinced by his cousin Isabella Gardner to hand it over to her. Today it resides in that museum of her name. Now, before we jump into this thing, I'm gonna give some background to the aesthetic movement and then define some key characteristics of it throughout the said jump into the painting. The aesthetic movement marked a point where artists became the ones who defined what was art or aesthetic and what was not in their own way. Founders of the movement like James McNeill Whistler would take a crap on conservative conventions, claiming that contemplation of beauty was its own reward and that you shouldn't get anything else out of it besides its intrinsic artistic qualities. Basically, screw all you boomers, the ones who define the beauty should be the people who actually make the paintings. Separate artistic qualities from subject matter and don't judge what we create. Then he'd probably drop the mic or something. Shit, I don't know. Alright, let's jump in this motherfucker. So the first thing our eyes are likely drawn to is the woman dancing in the foreground. Right off the bat, we have 2 characteristics of the aesthetic movement. Interestingly strained poses, whether they be frozen or in motion in this case. The woman is on the verge of tipping over. Her arms twist like licorice as she pulls the skirt of her dress and maneuvers her hand through the air around her. Characteristic number 2, women as art objects. Right, I know that sounds bad at first, but it's not what it seems, trust me. First, let's shove that elephant out of the room. This woman is not a sexualized object. If you don't agree with me, I will elaborate, and then if you still disagree, you can be silently spiteful. The shadow blocks us from viewing her face, so we don't get a visually intimate connection with her identity. Also, her head and arms are the only thing exposed to the viewer, shown in an awkward but simultaneously graceful fashion. We don't get any potentially erotic perspectives of this dancer. What we're meant to focus on is the dance that the woman is in the middle of performing, not the woman herself. She is an essential vehicle for delivering the flamenco aesthetic. Although this is my favorite painting to date, I would probably geek over it even more if the guitarists were the dominating figures, but they're not, because that's not how flamenco works in the first place, and men as art objects are not a characteristic in the aesthetic movement. But before we move on, let's just take a moment to appreciate the immaculate job of painting the folds of fabric. Ooh, baby, that's perfection. Alright, as we continue to gaze at this masterpiece, the eyes are likely drawn to the left where the guitarists are going at it. Now, I have a built-in devil's advocate section in my brain, so maybe that's just me and my obsession with guitar, but who really cares? We're already here. So which one did you pick? Is he slumped over drunk or howling with the wolves? Wrong both times. He's actually singing at the top of his lungs. Your boy over here thought he was slumped over plastered beyond measure, but if you look down at his hands, they're nicely sitting on his lap. If this guy was slumping, his arms would be draping down his sides. Further to the left, getting an earful of this guy's bars, are 2 guitarists nearly identical in dress and motion. They play in harmony, but each has their own chord progression so as to bounce off of each other, following the dancer and her feet to keep in time. Moving on, you might have noticed that handprint on the wall. This is very mysterious to me, and then I read somewhere that the handprint, along with the outline of a bowl, which took me a minute to notice, leaves a primitive note to the arrangement, and boom, it clicked. When most people think of cave paintings, to think of either Ice Age or the caves of Lascaux, but the first cave paintings were actually discovered in Altamira in the year of 1879 in Cartagena, Spain. This is the same year Sargent took his trip to Spain, and by the time he completed El Jaleo in 1882, there was still controversy as to whether the cave paintings should have a place in art history. I would like to think that this is Sargent taking his side in the matter, and I can see why. Flamenco's origin is not only in empty houses throughout Andalusia, but also in the caves of Sacramente. After learning of the bull outline's existence, I immediately scanned the rest of the wall and found this thing on the top left and then a couple olés on the right. Not sure what this thing is, but it makes sense to have olés on the wall, especially about the people on this side of the room. They would be the ones yelling it throughout the performance. Passing between the chair and the hanging guitar. Oh wait. This is a sick orange. Notice how this orange is one of the few examples of vibrant color in the 9 by 12 foot painting. Think about that, 9 by 12 feet. The only other bits of color is the green in the dancer's outfit and the red in the seated girl's outfits. Even with this slight bit of color in the composition, balance is created throughout the painting, dominated by whites, blacks, and grays. Moving back to the horizontal line of subjects, we see a young man, possibly a boy, clapping to the music. Notice these small lines of red adding to that slight balance. At the painting's edge, there's a third guitarist waiting for his turn to hop in the performance. His head leans back for a quick rest. Touching back on the walls real quick, notice how Sargent fills the entire wall while leaving it completely blank at the same time. The only tangible items on the wall are 2 guitars hanging to the left. They likely belong to the young boy clapping and to the singer closest to the dancer. The dancer's shadow thrashes back and forth as she moves across the stage. Little marks here and there do the rest of the job. Now we come to the right side of the dancer. Almost lost in shadow is another clapping man. A small bit of space separates him from the 2 women sitting and swaying their arms, occasionally clapping as well. They are dressed in white with little bits of red, deep or otherwise. Now comes my favorite part, the lighting. When I first was introduced to El Jaleo, I thought it was extremely eerie and mysterious. However, after further research, I found this was simply conventional lighting for flamenco at the time. The candles lighting the edge of the stage are simply out of sight. I also think this was Sargent's way of nodding further at flamenco's origins from the caves of Sacramente. Furthermore, Sargent's favorite style of flamenco was soleares, a more serious and solemn flamenco form of loneliness. This was a form not usually appreciated by those that were not gypsies, which is where flamenco comes from. I believe this is the form of flamenco that Sargent meant to convey, which may have contributed to the mixed reactions that the painting was met with. Most other paintings associated with Hispanism are more joyful and escapist, which is not 100% present here. But try as he might, Sargent's masterpiece was still lumped in with Hispanism. It's even the first result on Google Images. There have been many articles and papers written on Sargent, and subsequently a plethora of those mention El Jaleo offering interpretations of the piece. One article by Professor Nancy G. Heller especially caught my attention. What's There, What's Not, a performer's view of Sargent's El Jaleo, points out many errors in judgment made by multiple articles on the painting. After reading its entirety, I struggle to believe that El Jaleo should be categorized as simply Hispanic. While it is true that flamenco is a Spanish term, the style was created by and for gypsies. Gypsies have always been seen as outcasts, and residents of Spain often shunned them from society. They were even unwelcome in Catholic confession for a while. But I think the categorization of this painting should be a question posed to the gypsies of the time. I mean, they are the subjects of this painting after all. Alas, we will never know for sure. Back to Professor Heller's paper. Along with calling out so many incorrect interpretations by past historians and critics, one of my own observations was caught in that camp as well. That being this guy over here singing his heart out instead of, sloshed against the wall. Another common misconception is the manton holding up the dancer's hair. Even a modern article I used for this video made that mistake, thinking it was a mantilla instead, which is only sometimes worn in Spanish classical dances. On top of that, most historians and critics pair the painting with dramatization or the artificial, and even claim that Sargent made new pictorial inventions inspired by his influences of the old masters, when really he was just depicting flamenco conventions accurately. She does accept the validity of some of these interpretations, but dismisses others as simply coincidence. However, I disagree. Remember when I proposed that Sargent might have seen flamenco as a perfect fit for his contributions to the aesthetic movement as a balance of convention, aesthetic or otherwise, and flamenco tradition? Right, well, I stand by that, and here's why. Our first example brings us to the singer right here. One historian compares his expression with those of the victims in Francisco Goya's 3rd of May, but Heller said screw that, saying that the singer is simply caught in a dramatic performance. Why can't it be both? Heller even writes that Sargent's favorite style of flamenco was soleares, which is themed in loneliness and solitude. The victims in the 3rd of May are about to be executed. They will die alone, separated from their families. I think the flamenco singer's expression and its pairing with Goya's masterpiece rhymes perfectly as a nod to the master painter's legacy and contextual accuracy. Second example, organizing the individuals in a horizontal line across the painting. This element follows compositional directionality and is essential in creating a cohesive image. Professor Heller did away with that, explaining that this is simply flamenco convention. When flamenco started taking the stage at venues like Café Cantantes, the stages were small, and there would be barely enough room for all the action, so the chairs will be lined up against the wall to make way for the dancer and provide sufficient view for the audience. But I say it again, why can't it be both? I mean, it can't be coincidence that Sargent knocked out 2 birds with 1 stone twice in a row, and I'm not even done yet. Example number 3, the empty chair. Now Heller actually includes the fact that formal artistic convention is satisfied here with the chair occupied by a single orange. The small dot of color moves the eyes from the dancer in the foreground backward in space, and the white chair bounces us back and forth with the white dress of the dancer. But she also notes that this is accurate in context as well. The chair is likely the dancer's, and it is her turn to perform, so naturally the chair is empty. Oh wait, there's more, with example number 4. Heller validates the rhyming of this one as well, the color palette. Many historians and critics write of Sargent's fascination with Goya and Velázquez, attributing the palette to these influences alone. Professor Heller adds that one need not search through art history to find precedents for things that Sargent would have seen in Café Cantantes. So where am I going with this? Because the examples are finished, but I'm still not done. If I could ask John Sargent one question, it would be the following. My mans, did you see flamenco, especially Jaleo, as a pure way of experiencing what would be later referred to as the aesthetic movement? Rewind back to what I said earlier. Contemplation of beauty is its own reward, and you shouldn't get anything out of it besides its intrinsic artistic qualities. The feeling and emotion tied to this beautiful genre of music, encapsulated in this mural-sized canvas. Even though the painting sold at its first exhibition, it did have, as already mentioned, its fair share of criticisms. There were many that could only appreciate El Jaleo so much before finding critiques that they felt were there. In a sense, it's poetically fitting, because this might have made him feel isolated and alone to a certain extent, much like the music that he found so much harmony in with convention and technique. If you like this video and you want to see more, like, subscribe, make a comment on what you might want to see more of. I only do this in my spare time, and I don't really have a lot of that. I don't know when the next video is going to come around, but there will be another one. In the meantime, just, live your life, do whatever, I don't know.